Coaching as Benevolence, a podcast for people who are curious about using coaching for self-development. I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings Grief and Loss Coaching.
And I'm L Shawn with Michelle Sage Place Positive Intelligence Coaching.
So we are actually recording on a different day than we typically record and at a different time of day. So I think that will have an impact a little bit on our conversation today. So we'll see how that goes because it is the evening here. We have been walking through our guided journal based off of our first couple of seasons of our podcast. And the guided journal is Coaching Nuggets of Wisdom to Inspire, Explore, Act, and Flourish. And it's a guided journal to live your best life. So far, we've been focused on the first section of Inspire and really have had some good conversations about prompts 1 through 4 and how we make meaning from them and provide space L Shawn and I to have conversations about them, but also hopefully to provide some level of inspiration for you to take with you to journal after these prompts as well. So we are actually on number 5 today in the first section, and it's all about surrender. And so I'm just going to read it and then we'll go from there. So what comes to mind when you think of the word surrender? For some of us, we could experience a sense of relief when we think of surrendering our worries, our cares, or our fears. Surrender usually implies another party or someone or something to surrender to. This could be a person with more authority or power, as in the case of war, or it could be a benevolent parental figure or higher power to whom we unburden ourselves, trusting that they can handle the thoughts and tasks that are too big or heavy for us to carry. Think about what surrender means to you and how you can be available to surrender. So I think one of the things this prompt does that the other prompts have not, it also highlights kind of some of the more challenging aspects of this topic of surrender. And, there's power dynamics at play here that are alluded to in this prompt. But on the other end of it, there's also this space of having a few pages in front of you to take a breath and really listen to what you want to surrender to. It seems like sometimes in life we can be fighting to get through things, to get what we want, to get through the day. And really, I think the goal of this prompt is to help us lean into what it feels like to have that sense of calm, to surrender throughout the day rather than feeling like we have to take everything on. And so I really appreciate this prompt in this inspiration section because the word surrender, just saying it aloud actually provides me some level of comfort and some level of peace. And it doesn't feel like I'm surrendering necessarily when I think about it in the context of this journal to something that, has more power. For instance, it feels more of me having more power myself by surrendering. So there's like this, I'm going to use that word again. I'm so sorry. Paradox of power here. Relating to the word surrender. And those are just some of the first few thoughts that come to my mind when I read this prompt. L Shawn, what's standing out to you for this prompt 5?
That I'm thinking about when I think about surrender, and also specifically this prompt. I like how you mentioned the power dynamics. If you are carrying a heavy load, or you are maybe the expectations are too high, or you're under a lot of stress and pressure, the idea of surrender, and this goes to the line, for some of us, we could experience a sense of relief when we think of surrendering our worries, our cares, our fears. This is something that comes to mind for me, especially when you're looking at a situation that's maybe bigger than yourself and you have this narrative in your mind that you're responsible for a certain outcome. So you have this outcome in mind, and there's this feeling that you are responsible for that outcome. And so that can be really heavy, and that can be taxing to carry that narrative that you're responsible for this outcome And especially when it's an unreasonable narrative and puts undue pressure on you. When I think about the word surrender, I go to the idea of a higher power and the idea of the process. So in coaching, we often say, trust the process. And I think there's a certain act of surrender in coaching, both for the coach and the client, where you are in a space in the coaching, in the process, where it may look like you're going in the wrong direction or things are not working out the way that you would expect it to. And then there's that whisper, trust the process. And that whisper of trust the process is a type of surrender, because when you're thinking about, you really want the outcome for the client to be successful. You want the client to feel like they are making progress, that they are going where they want to go, where they want to be. There's this narrative that you can sometimes carry in this, and I'll just speak personally for myself. In the early days when I was coaching, I often took on the responsibility of my client succeeding, taking on the responsibility that my client would feel satisfied with the process or feel satisfied with the work we did in coaching. And so I put a lot of undue pressure on myself to do it right, to do it in a way that's going to result in that outcome. And as I got more experienced in coaching, the more that I surrendered to the process, the more that I trusted the client and I trusted that this is something that was co-created. The outcome is not mine. It doesn't belong to me. It's not my responsibility. My responsibility is to be in the process, to be present, to mirror, to observe, to share observations. And the outcome is something entirely different from those actions that I take. So the outcome is not mine. The outcome is something totally different. And so in surrendering, in trusting the process, it allowed me to be a better coach. It allowed me to stay present. It allowed me to be a thought partner and a companion to my client without that heavy expectation that this is going to result in a certain way. And if I do this and this and this in this way and ask the right questions and show up and really perform, this is all going to be great. And just letting that go and being like, hey, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if the client is going to feel good about this or if there's going to be a breakthrough, but that's the beauty of it. The beauty of it is I don't know. My client doesn't know. We're going to do this together. And what is revealed can be beyond our imagining. And it can show up in such unexpected ways. So those are the things that I'm thinking about when I think about surrender, is how it frees us and it allows us to open up to possibilities that we may not hold because we have this specific idea of the outcome. That was a long-winded answer, Eryn.
No, it was so well articulated. And I just wrote down the word outcomes in my journal. I want to come back to that because I really appreciate that's what you really highlighted in terms of as coaches, not focusing so much on the outcomes and focusing more on being a supportive space for the process to unwind. And I love what you shared about that. And I think that we can focus on outcomes as coaches with our clients and get into a lot of challenging places. And then on the other hand, when we do surrender and trust that process, sometimes the scary part is how much time it takes. Or like when we are in the middle of that roadblock and we can't see past that big boulder, or it feels like, we're going backwards and can't even see any level of well-being, right, moving forward. And I think that is a really good way that you frame that in terms of how we can suspend our own focus on outcomes, as well as also our supporting our clients to maybe not be so wedded to them as well. And that can be hard too. And so I like what you said there. And then eventually I want to come back because you also mentioned like surrendering to a higher power. But then you also talked about asking questions that wasn't maybe necessarily related to that. But going into this asking questions place, surrendering does require, like you spoke with the questions, curiosity. And we talk about curiosity a lot in coaching, but it does require that to be able to surrender. And, even just taking that in the day to day outside of coaching, it's like, what does that look like when we can just surrender to a situation that is unfolding when we were expecting or wanting a different outcome? And I think that gives us, again, if we can just hold that phrase in our own minds and it gives us our own power back to be able to say in my day to day, even when things get tricky or challenging, because that's where we spend our time, right? Like it's not these, and when people come to coaching, it can be those big life changes and the big, career questions of career shifts and all these other things. But really just in the day to day, this is where surrender, I think, has a lot of impact for people and can have a lot of positive support and tools and resources to draw from. Just the word when encountering challenging familial conversations, feeling a little bit stuck in the day, feeling low energy, or thinking that the outcome should look different. So I think there's so much with this word that has so much promise that can be used in coaching and then also outside of coaching to help people eventually get to where they're meant to be. Maybe not where they want to be, but where they're meant to be. And I feel like I'm grappling that a little bit in my own life, with my own career, in terms of that, like, how do I surrender to where I'm at and trust that process, especially when I'm not sure where I want to be moving forward. Like, usually there's a clearer picture. And so even with it, when there's ambiguity, it can almost be harder sometimes to surrender, even though you don't know what you need anyway. So you think it'd be easier, right? Or I would think it would be easier to surrender when the outcomes seem more ambiguous, but it's still a challenge. It's still, I guess, back and forth. And like, it takes energy to be able to surrender in that way. So I guess I'm feeling that just, personally, career-wise, like, what am I doing? Where am I headed? And it feels a little bit challenging to surrender in that space. And then, we do talk about that, and I have it in my book as well, but that when we float on our back, right, we still end up somewhere else. And that's a level of surrender, that imagery of, you can have goal-directed outcomes. And this is in relationship to what I talk about in my book with Hope Theory by C.R. Snyder. But you can have goal-directed outcomes where you're very specific about how you're going to get those right. And then there will be obstacles that you have to pivot and construct a new pathway to get there and those sorts of things. And that's one way to think about surrendering in some ways. Surrendering by, okay, I'm going to do plan B, C, D, E, and so on. So there's that level of goal-directed energy, but there's also that of just floating and ending up somewhere else. Like, you're floating in the ocean and you end up in a completely different space, and you didn't have as much intention tied to what that was, but you surrendered. And by surrendering, that, yes, that was intentional, but you end up in a new place that gives you more meaning, new information, and a fresh set of eyes, I guess, on a situation. So when anybody, I think, is feeling stuck, there's different ways to approach like movement toward goals where it's not specifically focused on outcomes. But as part of that process, surrender has to be built in. It has to be built in. I feel like when I made my transition from working at CU to staying home with my kids, like, I felt like I wanted to hold on like with this rope so tightly instead of just surrendering, which made the process that much harder for me. Like, why do we do that? Why do I do that? I don't know. Anyway, LaShawn, can you answer that question for me, please? No. Why do I do those things? But so
I have the same question myself. Like, there are things that we hold on to that hurt us more to hold on to than to let go. And what comes to mind is better the devil you know. You know that whatever it is you're holding on to no longer serves you and is no longer relevant, but you're holding on to it because it's familiar and because there's something that you got out of it. And maybe we're not ready to let go. We're not ready to move on to what we're becoming. And maybe we're not ready to acknowledge what we're becoming. So there's so much there. And another thing that comes to mind is just to give ourselves grace. And I want to go back to your image of floating in the ocean and the idea that you are just, surrendering to the current. You're surrendering to where the waves take you. You're surrendering to wherever the motion is going to, wherever it's going, you're going to go with it. And so what came to mind when you were talking about that, the image of just like letting yourself be held and letting yourself be taken. And the idea that you don't know where that's going to be. You just know that you're going to trust and surrender to this bigger body of water, because we're talking about the ocean, and that brings to mind the idea of a higher power. That brings to mind being part of something bigger. And so just the fact that you're in the ocean, you're floating, you aren't doing anything except for maybe the posture of your body. And yet there's motion. And that also calls to question what happens when we swim against the current. One thing that I'm thinking about is like riptides, they are really strong and you can't swim against them. The only thing you can do is swim parallel to the shore to the point where you go through it. Like you eventually get past it and you just have to like swim parallel to the shore. So that makes me think about goal-oriented action. The shore is our goal. As long as we swim and we keep that shore in our sights, we are eventually going to go through, hopefully, and past that riptide. So there's so much in that image that you brought up, Eryn, that the vastness, the openness, the feeling of the current and things in play that we may not understand or we don't know and we have no control over. We don't have any control over the currents in the ocean. We have no control over whether or not when we do that, when we float on the ocean, we have no control over whether or not the ocean's going to take us further in where there's like nothing and then eventually we will lose our strength and we will drown, or if it will take us somewhere where we will find land or somewhere more shallow. We just don't know, but we're trusting that. So we don't know the outcome, yet in that moment, for whatever reason, it could be exhaustion, it could be faith, it could be, whatever, we just decide that we're going to float and we're going to let the current take us wherever. And then in that image is the idea that there is maybe even some benevolence there, that it's not going to be your demise, or maybe it will be your demise, but that maybe will be something that protects you from total failure, or a demise or death. Because, there are tales of dolphins and orca that help sailors and people, that were in boats, the shipwreck, and then they somehow help them in some way. So there's the benevolence of the animal kingdom, There's these ideas that there are so many unexpected things that can happen when you surrender. And then, of course, there are ways when you surrender where not such good things happen. But nonetheless, there is the sense that we cannot be sure what is going to happen. And so when we surrender, there's a sense that maybe something unexpected will happen, like driftwood will come along and you get to cling on to it and maybe eventually find land, or a boat will come along and you'll get rescued. Something like that. You just never know what can happen when you surrender. So those are some things that came to mind as you were talking, especially the image of the ocean and the idea,
Yeah.
things that are bigger than us.
I love how you nuanced that so well. It is I was sitting there and having various emotions as you were talking about that, from everything from like following you were a great storyteller. Like I felt like I was following a whole story line there. And then when you got to the piece of like maybe a driftwood is gonna come along, or to highlight your point on benevolence and stuff, I had this like really sad moment within myself. I was like, people have always told me I have a positivity bias, which I think I do. Like I tend to see things glass half full in some ways. But on the other end of that, I don't ever really appreciate or see or even think that something positive will happen to me coming my way in that way. Does that make sense? Or like that there will be a driftwood coming my way, and that it's actually supposed to it's meant to be a helpful thing and a loving thing. Like I just had this moment of like, wow, why have I gone throughout most of my life without seeing it that way? And I don't know, the way you described it, it really, I think, sat with me pretty deeply, and didn't take that away for sure. In terms of like, okay, there are these good things that can come away that are meant. And I think for me, as somebody in the helping professions, it's usually like, oh, I'm meant to help them, or I'm meant to help with this situation, or I meant to, like, I don't know but anyway, that really, really stuck with me. And then when you're talking about surrendering, your goal, you don't have an outcome in mind, but your goal is to get to the land, the shore. You said the shore. I was wondering in my own mind, like, okay, so what is the shore for most of us? Is it contentment? Is it safety? Is it adventure? Is it like I don't know. It really made me think a little bit more about what surrender may lead us to. And it may not be, again, like exactly what we asked for, or like, let's say we're swimming, parallel, and we end up on the shore and we wanted adventure and we get solace, or, like it's just, I think it just shows like how interconnected we all are with all the systems, but also how little control, we do have. And so if we fight that, like thinking we have all this control, I think that in my own lived experience is where I run into problems, challenges, right? And so because I let's say I get to the shore, I'm like, no, I did want adventure, darn it. And I'm going to have the adventure, even though solace is what's waiting for me. And I think in that case, it comes back to listening and in different levels of, meditation and things like that. And I think that can be really powerful if we do take the time to listen more. And I think listening is an act of surrendering. And it's something, in coaching, we always use as our foundational skill set that we bring to the table when we work with clients and work with people, is how effectively we can listen. And I think that those two words go together pretty nicely, that surrender and listening piece. So I guess I want to go back to that driftwood, because it really stuck out to me. I'm like, why did I always think like the driftwood's not going to help, but I need to help? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Did that resonate with you in the same way, or completely different, or I don't know?
Yeah, and I think that, when you're in the profession of helping others, and you're like, when we focus our talents on others, and it can be a challenge to focus that inward and to use that same perspective of hope and positivity for ourselves, especially when we're in it. I think when you're in a difficult situation, or when you're in a situation where you feel like there's nothing, and there's no movement, or there's no support, then that is what you're going to see. So if we're in a state of feeling abandoned, or the more that we cling on to the idea of abandonment, we're going to see evidence of abandonment. But if we shift and pivot to possibility, Yeah, I know I'm floating in this ocean. And as far as I can see, it's all water. And, you can start to think about all the things that are stacked against you in that moment. That is resistance as well, where you're just thinking about all the things that are stacked against you rather than thinking about the possibilities. Like I'm floating in this ocean, a piece of driftwood could come, or I'm floating in this ocean, a storm could come, and the waves can really get me closer to land, or rather than thinking that this is all there is, and seeing more and more evidence that supports that, it's difficult to shift and pivot to what you don't see. Yet, we are in a profession where we see what's not seen, and we hear or we think about what's not being said. That's what we're trained to do as coaches. Yet, when we're in a situation where we might feel like we're just getting hit on all sides, it's hard to pivot and say, where am I not getting hit? Or where is there not turmoil? Because when all you see is turmoil, then it's very difficult to pivot to where is there not. But that's what we're trained to do. And I think if we can, that goes back to what you said about listening. I think there's a surrender in patience and waiting. And patience, like you were saying, you get to the shore and you want an adventure and you have solace. There is wisdom and also surrender in, okay, I have solace now and I want adventure. That there's nothing that says that adventure is not coming. Right now I'm in solace and this is where I'm at, and that could change. And then you get adventure and you want solace. So you're never happy. But
never satisfied.
Never satisfied. Exactly. So yeah, just knowing like that, I think that is an act of surrender, accepting where you are, accepting that right now there's solace, and what can I learn from this? Or I want adventure. How can I prepare for adventure in this solace? What is the utility of this that I don't want? What can I learn from this, and what can I gain? So that's actually those are some questions that we ask in positive intelligence, the three gifts of the sage. That those are things that we can turn to, and I think we can only really turn to those tools that we have, Eryn, when we give ourselves space and time, just like we do with our clients.
Yeah, I love that. And space and time, for our clients themselves as well, to again go back to that process piece of things may not happen very quickly. And then I love how you highlighted then with whatever is happening in that space, even though it's not what you, me, I, or whomever wanted, there's gifts within that. And what are those? And I know that I people might see that as sometimes a form of like, oh, toxic positivity, that, but
Yeah.
I struggle with that phrase. I do. I struggle because I think that the perspective shifting that gives people the opportunity in that space to surrender necessitates what you talked about. Like it does require that there is, okay, I'm open to this now, even though it's not what I wanted, or I'm open to what's unraveling in front of me right now, even though it's taking a lot of time. And I think there's this openness. Maybe it's, I don't have to like it. I don't have to understand it, but I can be open to it. And I think that can be really challenging too, because there is a little bit of discomfort. There might be some pain or other things that go on. And so that in itself can kind of go back to like when you've talked about the salve that, like the compassion that we can give ourselves or the grace that we can give ourselves to, just going back. I think all of this wraps up for me as I'm talking aloud. I'm just like rambling here, but as I'm talking about the reps, it does go back to that higher power piece, that interconnected piece. It just really resonates for me here a lot. We don't, and I think that's the journey with faith as well. Like I don't have to have the answers. And I don't have to understand everything, but I can have faith in this situation. And here is how, or I don't agree with this. And so I can either do this or surrender in this way, or maybe even as an act of surrender, state a form of protest or things like that. It's not always passive. This is something else that I'm kind of coming to as we were having this conversation. But yeah, like that idea of today, Rick talked about doubting Thomas, or that whole passage, and how Jesus, came to the situation. He didn't shame him. He showed him. And like it just kind of this idea that like shame can get in the way of our surrendering, right? And when we are helping other people, especially as coaches, right? Like that's one of our key understandings. We're not going to we're going to try our best to not shame someone, right? Like or it's even our lived philosophy, because as coaches we also are like wedded to this coach way of being that we live out, and shame is part of that, and how we move with that. But for some reason the word shame right now is really sticking out to me as a way that, as a word, as a feeling, as a way of being that can get in the way of surrendering. And when that is done by someone else, right, that makes it that much more challenging. But when we internalize that feeling and really turn that in on ourselves, I think that can lead to some of the most significant moments of despair. And when I have been in my worst throes of depression, if I look at those roots in different spaces with that, with the word shame, that is just such a highlight that had gotten in the way of helping me to surrender to certain help that I might need, or just what is. And so I just can deeply feel, I guess, from my own lived experience when I've dealt with debilitating depression, how shame kind of disrupted the ability to surrender. And I think it was shame more than anything. I'm trying, like, is it, of course, depression, but what, kept me from surrendering. And I think that word is key. So, yeah.
Yeah, bringing in shame. I mean, that in itself is its own,
Yeah,
its
sorry.
own conversation. But no, I think that that's really important, because that is something that can really prevent us from surrendering. Because I think shame is probably one of the most powerful triggers for our ego. Because when shame is part of the experience, it's so painful that surrendering, it can feel like you're admitting to whatever it is that's causing the shame. By surrendering, it's like you're admitting to it. Whereas and shame really colors, so it really dims and blocks out the light. In the light of clarity, it distorts. It's so deeply rooted in our identity and our ego that when shame is felt and experienced, it eclipses a lot of the outlets that we can have, or the avenues to a lighter, more loving experience. And shame also causes us to believe that we don't deserve it. There's so much with shame. Shame is such a heavy and debilitating emotion and experience. It is rooted in fear. And so it really causes the ego to be active. And so it's difficult for the ego to allow for any kind of vulnerability. And surrender requires vulnerability. So there's so much there, Eryn, and I think that that is like another episode altogether. And I know we did touch on shame in earlier episodes, but I do feel like shame is definitely one of those things that does prevent us from being able to surrender because it keeps us locked in the past and it keeps us locked in this idea of who we're afraid we are. And
Yeah.
and when it's triggered and when shame shows up and you're feeling that shame, it makes it extremely difficult for us to be vulnerable and to be open. And that's what surrender requires.
Yeah. So I guess my question then is, how can we surrender when we are in those more difficult spaces or when shame is there? Is there something that comes to mind for you, LaShawn, based off of, yeah.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is often if you're experiencing shame. I mean, this comes back to what we learned when well, Eryn and I are both, we have done some family constellation work. And I'm right now in the middle of a certification course with Kyla Mitsunaga, who was a guest. She was, I think, the first guest that we had in not last season, it was season 4, I want to say.
Oh, that long ago.
It was a while ago.
Time has passed since.
Time has flown by. I want to say it may have been like earlier in like
Yeah.
2. But anyway, it doesn't matter. The thing that is brought to mind, and one of the things that Kyla Mitsunaga talks about is the idea of awareness and acknowledgement. And this comes from her Mitsunaga method, which is trademarked. And she talks about this in her constellation work when she does constellations. And so my answer to that would be that shame needs to be seen. And often we don't look at shame because it's painful to look at shame because it just really is rooted in our most primal fear. It lies and it dwells in the basement of our spiritual house. And so it's difficult to go down those stairs and it's difficult to go deep into the darkness to look at shame, but that's what needs to be done. And in order to look at shame, we need support. And so I think it's really important for us to look to those people that we trust and those people that support us and, the people that we can lean on, because being able to look at shame and see shame is difficult. And so I think it's really important to look for those supports, that whether it's your faith or whether it's a loved one that you can call, and also stop. I think the first thing that we need to do is just stop. Whatever, if we're feeling like, we have to prove ourselves or we have to do something because of fear, I think the best thing that we can do is just take a breath, pause, get out of that sympathetic nervous system, disrupt. I think disruption is really important too, whether that's taking a walk, taking a very quick break if you can. So I think that's really important. And often we don't even know it's shame because it hides really well. It may present itself as anger, indignant, feeling indignant, feeling righteous. These things are your ego protecting you from really having to look at and acknowledge your fear, and that you're vulnerable in that moment. So it's going to present itself in different ways, and we may not even see that it's shame.
Yeah, I love that you use the word disruption because I think that is so different from surrender, but they go together in various capacities, and I really like that. And I think that that's another word people can hold on to when they are starting to maybe spiral a little bit or go down that road and just think, okay, disruption. And then there's something I can do to disrupt in that moment or whatever. But I love everything you said about shame and how it requires support from others and a space to be vulnerable and for it to be seen. I think that that's all, invaluable. And my hope is that one day we get to that space, and maybe a lot of people have this already, where it's not happening as after the fact. It's more preventative, right? It's much more of a preventative way that people carry each other and hold each other and love each other, right? In the system that we all are swimming in, and have grace not only for themselves, but for one another as well. Like there's just this big opening, and I use that word open again, but I feel like with the word surrender, I'm opened up to explore so much more, I think, with this prompt than I was with maybe the prior prompts, even though when I was read this prompt, I'm like, oh, this is a shorter prompt. I don't like how we worded some of the things in here. And it's much more than what's here. And so again, when you start to journal or have conversations with your friends or whomever you want to talk about this journal, there's so much that can be uncovered here that can lead to more contentment and more self actualization and honesty and authenticity and all of those things. So I've just really enjoyed being able to explore this prompt this evening with you, LaShawn, and your language. I think especially tonight, we should just give props to LaShawn with her language and what she has said throughout the podcast. I think it's been so crystallized in such beautiful ways, and I've really liked it and have learned a lot just from listening to you, LaShawn. So wanted to put that out there.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And likewise, your imagery, and you also have very clear and precise language as well. And I think that is something that, and like you said, we're doing this at a different time. I've also been in the field in the constellation work because I have my certification. And I think it has a lot of the clarity and a lot of what has come through has to do with, spending 2 days, working on constellation work. It exhausts
That is so
me,
cool.
but
I didn't make that connection. And now,
yeah. So it's like really fresh in my mind. And also I feel really connected to the wisdom of the field as well. So I think if I was at work and, it was another day, we usually record on Mondays and I'm at work and I'm often kind of distracted because, there's so much going on at work. But just to have this space and the time, and also just coming off of, a weekend of family constellation work and being in the field and working with people, and this being in our, what we've been talking about. Surrender is a big part of constellation work. So yeah, I think that a lot of that has to do with just being tapped into the field. Normally I'm just like, what's going on
over there? No. That's cool though, that the field is, bringing that wisdom in various ways. And so,
yeah, it's really interesting.
So we have a call to action, right?
Yes, we should move on to the call to action. We're almost an hour in.
This one took way longer than last week's, and last week had more written, and so
yeah. So yeah, I don't know. Do you want to share your call to action? I'm happy.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
So
go ahead.
I think what's standing out to me for my call to action is listening. I know there's all these words are going through my head, like shame and surrender and disruption and outcomes and goals and all these things we've talked about. But listening is really, I think, one of the tools that you can use at any time by taking that pause and listening to yourself. And that can help with this whole process of surrendering and help you to surrender. So I would say my call to action is to this week, maybe try taking a few breaths throughout the day and listening to yourself, and then also listening to what's going on around you.
Yeah, my call to action is very similar to that. And that is in terms of surrender. And this is also part of the prompt, is to think about when you're writing the journal. I think having a conversation with a loved one, a trusted loved one, about surrender. Where is it showing up in your life? Where does it show? Where do they see it showing up? Like, you could even ask that person, especially if you have a history with that person and they've seen you grow and evolve as a human being. You could even ask them, hey, what have you noticed about me when I surrender? Or what do you notice about me when I should surrender, or you think I should, or it would be a good idea to surrender, and I'm just doubling down? Where are my blind spots? So just have that conversation. My call to action is to have a conversation with someone that you trust and someone who can be a thought partner. It could even be a coach, or a healing practitioner, that you can have that conversation, a meaningful conversation about surrender, and maybe go to the prompt and write and then see what's revealed. Thanks for joining us for Coaching as Benevolence. I'm LaShawn with Michelle's Sage Place, Positive Intelligence Coaching.
And I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings, Grief and Loss Coaching.
Have a benevolent day.